You would think there would be a giant no smoking sign when transporting 9,000 gallons of JP8 fuel, similar to what you see on oil tankers. But no, the military doesn't seem to care about all possible things that could go wrong, including hearing loss. You heard it right, if you don't have hearing loss. Exposure to Jet Propulsion Fuel 8, commonly known as JP8, has been linked to hearing problems. And it's not so much that you can't hear things, it's that your brain cannot process the auditory message very well. Think about dyslexia, but for ears. So maybe we should store airplane fuel somewhere else, say inside the wings? Well, we do that, but not because of hearing loss. The question should be, why wouldn't you want to store fuel in the wings, also referred to as wet wings? Let's face it, if you're a B-2 bomber, you don't really have another choice but to keep the fuel in your wings. Until the 1950s, airplanes stored fuel in the tanks within their fuselage, and they still do that to some extent. But there are some very good reasons why many airplanes keep their juice in their wings. When it comes to commercial jets, space is everything. After all, every single aspect of a modern commercial jet is designed to make as much money as possible. Whether it's cramming the most number of seats possible, building a second deck, or filling the unused space in the belly of the aircraft with commercial cargo. Building a second deck or a special area inside the main fuselage just for fuel storage doesn't make sense, especially when you don't have to. Even with military aircraft, it makes sense to store fuel inside the wings as the wing structure is watertight, meaning that no additional reservoir or bladder is needed, which reduces manufacturing costs. However, some airplanes do require bladders inside the wings, which makes it more expensive. But there are some exceptions, like the famous SR-71 Blackbird. When the Blackbird took to the sky, its airframe started leaking, leaving a trail of jet fuel on the tarmac. But this was by design and not a flaw. As Blackbird would reach a speed of 2,200 miles per hour, the airplane components would heat up and expand. To allow for that expansion, the fuselage panels were purposely positioned farther apart. But this caused fuel leakage at the beginning of the flight. The leakage would stop shortly after Blackbird was airborne, once the components had heated up. The initial loss of fuel would demand aerial refueling shortly after takeoff. But saving on space and costs is just one of the numerous reasons why many aircraft store fuel in their wings. How important is it for aircraft to be properly balanced? Very important is the correct answer. Just so you can appreciate this, if all the passengers just moved to the back of an aircraft, this is what could happen. But losing balance can be catastrophic. In 2013, a Boeing 747 was carrying 207 tons of cargo, including 5 armored vehicles that were not properly secured. The weight shift that occurred shortly after takeoff rendered the aircraft uncontrollable and resulted in a devastating crash. All 6 crew members lost their lives. Given how important the balance of an aircraft is, it should come as a no-brainer that having fuel in wings, which are located roughly in the middle of the aircraft, would be advantageous. In fact, the center of gravity of an airplane is close to where the wings are attached to the fuselage. As a result, as fuel is consumed from the wings, there is minimal change to the center of gravity of the airplane. An Airbus A380 has fuel tanks in its rear stabilizers called trim tanks. Fuel can be pumped in and out of trim tanks in order to adjust the center of gravity, which would translate to fuel savings. It's also worth noting that some aircraft like Boeing 737 and A330, which have center tanks in their fuselage, would use that fuel first before burning the fuel that's stored in the wings. Why do you think that is? We'll come back to it. But while we're on the topic of balance, let's talk about one major issue with wet wings: sloshing. An Airbus A380 can carry up to 82,000 gallons of fuel, most of which is stored in the wings. Just imagine, during turbulent weather or when the aircraft rolls, all that fuel can suddenly shift inside the wings, causing an imbalance. So to prevent sloshing, baffles were introduced, which were large pieces of metal with a hole through the middle, segmenting the wing while allowing fluid to pass through, but not all at once. A simple yet effective solution. If anyone's looking for a wingman, this is your guy. Back in 2008, an Air Canada A330 experienced multiple fuel pump failures. Even though all fuel pumps had stopped working, fuel still continued to flow to the engines. But how? In most aircraft, engines are located below the wings. This allows for gravity feeding. So in case a fuel pump malfunctions, fuel could still be supplied from each wing to its respective engine. And this is why the fuel in the wings is consumed last. So in case of an emergency, gravity feeding remains an option. Sometimes it takes some effort to fit jokes into our videos, but this one came quite easily. We just had to look up aeroelastic flutter. It's an unstable, self-excited structural oscillation at a definite frequency where energy is extracted from the airstream by the motion of the structure. And let us show you what it looks like. Oh, my bad. The self-excited part really threw me off. Aeroelastic flutter is a simple harmonic motion. Once an elastic structure, like aircraft wings, falls in a sort of rhythm or oscillation as it interacts with the air around it, a positive feedback loop is created, which makes those oscillations bigger and more pronounced. These uncontained vibrations can lead to the destruction of an aircraft. Filling the aircraft wings with fuel helps in mitigating flutters. But flutter is not just associated with aircraft. In 1940, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge in Washington collapsed in high winds because of aeroelastic flutter. If the weight of an aircraft, including the fuel, lies in the fuselage, the wing root carries the brunt of the load when the aircraft is airborne, which over time puts a lot of stress on the airframe. The solution is to get stiff wings. Really? By storing fuel in the wings, the increased rigidity makes it more difficult for the wings to bend upward, reducing the stress on the wings and airframe. How can we talk about fuel without talking about fire? If there's ever a fire on a plane, it's much better for it to be outside in the wings as opposed to inside the fuselage where the crew and the passengers could be exposed to the fumes. Most wings are made of extremely fire-resistant aluminum, which can withstand fire for a few minutes while dissipating the heat. Fires starting in the wings are also much easier to spot. Enough about wet wings. Become a Boneyard Patreon and get a handwritten letter from Not What You Think.